Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're calling in from. Welcome to the May Business of Alt Protein seminar. My name is Audrey Gear, and I am a Startup Innovation Specialist here at the Good Food Institute. We're going to give folks just a minute or two to log in. We have quite a few people who have registered today. In the meantime, I'd love to learn where everyone is calling in from. I am currently in Los Angeles in California. It's quite rainy out there. I would love to see where the rest of you. So if you would like to pop that in the chat, it would be great to say hello. See some folks are from London, the UK, the Netherlands, New York, Chile, Seattle. Wow, it's great to see such a global group of folks. Switzerland's hello, and welcome. Even Peru and Idaho. Hello, everyone. So we guess we can go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is about a really complex topic, which is navigating the FDA's pre-market food ingredient evaluation programs. So after this seminar, we hope you'll walk away with a better understanding of the pre-market review process for food and color additive petitions, and a better understanding of GRAS and FDA's GRAS notification program. We do have an hour and a half set aside for this seminar today, so we will have lots of time for you to ask your questions towards the end. And before we get going, I do just have a few housekeeping items. First, for those of you who might be new to the work of the Good Food Institute, we are an international nonprofit organization, and we are developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions, we mobilize resources and talent, and we empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and most importantly, delicious. Second, this seminar will be recorded. We will post this to our YouTube channel. We will also email all of you a copy of the recording, as well as a copy of the slide deck. So if you missed something, if you need to drop off early, no worries. You can come back and rewatch this and look through the slides again. So all of this information will be available to you post-seminar. And third, for any of you who may have missed the announcement, GFI is bringing back the Good Food Conference. That will be held in San Francisco this September. And this conference will bring together over 1,000 innovators, scientists, policymakers, industry leaders, philanthropists, and global champions, everyone who's committed to building the alt protein industry. Registrations for that will be going live soon. So we'll pop a link in the chat so you can sign up for those notifications to get your tickets when they become available. So with all that housekeeping, it is now my pleasure to introduce our expert speaker today. So with that, Dr. Stiffy Heiss, welcome. Dr. Heiss joined the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, in 2019 as a regulatory review scientist and microbiology reviewer in the Division of Food Ingredients within the Office of Food Additive Safety. Dr. Heiss has managed the review of numerous generally recognized as safe, so GRAS notices, with a particular emphasis on microbial-derived ingredients, bacteriophage preparations, and live microbial cultures, as well as approval of direct food additive and color additive petitions that have been submitted to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition at FDA. So as a regulatory review scientist, one of Dr. Heiss's primary duties is managing both GRAS evaluation teams and petition review teams. Dr. Heiss is also a member of several work groups, including the Cultured Meat Pre-Market Consultation Working Group and the DFI Infant Formula Working Group. Dr. Heiss clearly has so much expertise. There's no one better to share with us how to navigate the FDA approval process. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Heiss.
Well, thank you, Audrey, for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Good Food Institute for the invitation to speak with everyone today and to share some information about our office's pre-market programs. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my slides here and get us started. So, as mentioned, I'm in the Office of Food Additive Safety, and I'm a regulatory review scientist and microbiology reviewer. And today I'm going to introduce you to three of our office's pre-market evaluation programs, the food and color additive petition processes, as well as the generally recognized as SAFE or GRAS notification program. But before we dive into the meat of the presentation, I do want to provide you with some insight to our approach to food innovation. So, of course, innovation in science and technology continue to generate new food production technologies. For example, leveraging precision fermentation in the production of novel food ingredients, such as proteins or carbohydrates, as well as novel sources of ingredients. And unlike other regulatory authorities around the world, FDA does not have a novel foods pathway or a novel foods program. And instead, we combine our longstanding authorities with policy and scientific knowledge to regulate food safety. And this approach we find is flexible and adaptable to a wide variety of new food production technologies and ingredients. And so I'm going to walk you through our established frameworks. That's again, food and color additive petitions and the GRAS notification program, because we find that these may be applied to innovative ingredients that are being added to conventional food. I'm going to take you on a little trip through history as it relates to food ingredient regulation in the United States. I'm going to start with, I'm sure everyone's favorite topic, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Herein you might hear me refer to this, as the FD&C Act, the Act, or the law. I'm going to provide you with an overview of the Act, as well as some pertinent definitions related to our time here today. We're then going to fast forward a little bit in time and talk about food and color additive petitions, as well as GRAS, including program and procedural overviews, as well as some common misconceptions that we've encountered. Finally, the undercurring heartbeat throughout the presentation and throughout these three established frameworks is our safety evaluation. And I'm going to provide you with an overview of that, including our safety standard. So without further ado, let's kick it off with an introduction to the Act. So in addition to laws that govern drugs and cosmetics, those that govern food and food ingredients fall under the Act. And it is the Act that provides the framework for overseeing the safety of the U.S. food supply. Now, this framework is provided for in the 1958 amendment, the Food Additive Amendment to the Act, in which we find the definition for food additive and the GRAS provision. Now, this amendment was passed by Congress in response to growing concerns about the use of new food ingredients being introduced into the food supply. So within this amendment, not only do we find these definitions, but we also find that it establishes the requirement for pre-market approval of new uses of food additives, which we'll talk about. It establishes the standard of review, the standard of safety, and formal rulemaking procedures. So as mentioned, the Food Additive Amendment to the Act established the pre-market approval requirement for food additives and a process for submitting what's called a food additive petition, or a FAP. But before we get into that, we need to define a food additive, and this amendment did such. In its broadest sense, a food additive is any substance, the intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result, directly or indirectly, in its becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristics of a food. So broadly speaking, any substance added to food. However, Congress made it clear in 1958 that the agency, FDA, should not devote resources for which there is an expert consensus regarding the safe use of a substance. And this is referred to as the GRAS provision provided for on this slide, unless the use of the substance is generally recognized as safe. And we'll break down what that means in the coming slides. But first, let's break apart that food additive definition, because as you saw on the last slide, it's rather large. What do we mean when we say directly or indirectly? Direct food additives are those that are added to food for a specific purpose, a specific technical effect in the food. Most of these are things that you're probably familiar with seeing on food ingredient labels, like sweeteners or preservatives. Oftentimes, these come into our office through what's called the Food Additive Petition Program. Secondary food additives are those that are added during manufacturing or processing. These are not intended to remain in the food after the technical effect has been accomplished. Think of things like processing aids, boiler water additives, and the like. Often these have come through our office through the Food Contact Notification, or FCN program. Indirect food additives are those that become part of the food in trace amounts due to packaging, storage, or other handling. So these are food packaging materials, plastics, paperboard, and the like. These come into our office through the Food Contact Notification Program, which we're not going to get into today. That's managed by a separate division within my office, but just to provide some insight as to what we're talking about when we say direct or indirect food additives. But of course, as the purpose of establishing a legal definition of food additive is to also establish a pre-market approval requirement, there are several exceptions to this definition, and I've listed those here. The first are prior sanctioned ingredients. Now, these are those that require explicit approval prior to that 1958 Food Additive Amendment, either by FDA or USDA. So this would be under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FD&C Act by FDA, or the Meat Inspection Act or Poultry Products Inspection Act of USDA. Color additives have separate regulations, which we'll get into. Pesticides and animal drugs have their other regulatory pathways, and dietary ingredients and dietary supplements, which are excluded from the definition of a food additive and are thereby also excluded from GRAS. So how are additives approved for use in the United States? To market a new food additive or before using an approved additive for a new intended use, a manufacturer must submit a petition proposing either a regulation prescribing under the conditions under which the food additive may be safely used, or an amendment to an existing food additive regulation. And in this case, the petitioner must include facts and data that demonstrate either that new information exists with respect to that food additive, or that new uses, say, have been developed, or old uses abandoned. We're going to fast forward 2 years and we're going to talk about color additives. Much like the Food Additive Amendment to the Act, I think you'll see a lot of parallels with the Color Additive Amendment to the Act, which was passed by Congress in 1960. This also established a pre-market approval requirement for color additives and a process for submitting what's called a color additive petition. Remember that color additives are accepted from the definition of food additives. They have their own separate regulations. In its broadest sense, a color additive can be defined as any dye, pigment, or other substance made by a process of synthesis or similar artifice that imparts color to food, drugs, cosmetics, or to the human body. So here with color additives, we have a much broader scope. But it's important to note that there is no natural color additive because you're adding something that imparts color and that would not normally be present. But that said, there are some substances that impart their own natural colors, like cherries, green or red peppers, chocolate, or even orange juice. They might not be considered color additives. But when you have a food substance that is deliberately imparting color, for example, beet juice, and you're adding it to something such as lemonade to make that lemonade pink, that beet juice then is considered a color additive. Why is that? Well, for any substance otherwise meeting the definition of a color additive to be exempt from that definition, it must be used in a way that its purpose or purposes is for something other than coloring. And that must mean that any color that's imparted must be unimportant in terms of the appearance, the value, the marketability, or consumer acceptability is concerned. So circling back to that beet juice example, that product is pink. It's marketed as such. Consumers expect it to be pink. Therefore, that beet juice is a color additive. I also want to highlight that unlike food additives, there is no GRAS provision for color additives. Color additives must require pre-market approval by FDA and come through the color additive petition program. Something else I want to touch on is certified colors versus exempt colors. Now, certified colors are those that require batch certification by FDA, and this is carried out by FDA's Office of Cosmetics and Colors, or OCAC. Now, for those that require certification, this was because at the time of their listing within the Code of Federal Regulations, or 21 CFR, which you'll see throughout this presentation, that color additive required compositional analysis by FDA to ensure compliance with the stipulated specifications for safety. So how this is achieved is that a representative sample from each batch, each and every batch, are sent to FDA by the manufacturer. They're analyzed, and if they are certified, the manufacturer will receive a certification number to accompany that marketed batch. So for example, a manufacturer may submit a batch of tartarazine to FDA, and once certified, that'll be assigned FD&C number, yellow number 5. So these are listed as FD&C numbers on the ingredients label. A substance of the same chemical identity that has not been through the certification process cannot be called by that corresponding FD&C color name. Now, that said, some colors are exempt from certification by FDA, and oftentimes these are derived from natural sources, although again, to recapitulate, there is no natural color additive because you're adding a substance that would not normally be present. And so when I say natural in this case, I'm referring things that are typically more from botanical or mineral sources. Think something like spirulina extract. Now, this was determined at the time of listing in the CFR that they do not require certification. And in fact, they don't require labeling by name on the food ingredient label. Instead, they may be called color added. However, carmine and cochineal extract do require labeling by name because there have been reports of allergenicity. So now I'm going to turn to the general review timeframe for a petition. And I do want to stress this is a general timeframe. Of course, extenuating circumstances can always happen, but this is the timeframe that we aim to achieve when reviewing a petition. Prior to the submission of a petition, a manufacturer, I'm going to refer to them in this case as the petitioner, may choose to have an optional pre-petition consultation. Typically, these are an hour-long meeting where the petitioner will provide a 30-minute overview, generally a PowerPoint presentation, of their expected petition. Since we don't evaluate drafts, this is a really great avenue that we encourage folks to leverage when developing their petitions. In this case, we have a multidisciplinary team of scientists who attend these meetings, and they can provide feedback or maybe aim to answer any questions if the petitioner has specific questions, perhaps on a particular data element or part of the petition. And petitioners are not limited to one. They can request as many pre-petition consultations as they need. So for example, some petitioners I've worked with are very early in their petition process. So they come in to get a sense and familiarize themselves with the requirements. And then following that, maybe a few years later, once they have all the necessary data and information and are getting ready to submit their petition, may come back for another consultation. So it varies depending on the petitioner. In any case, once a petition is formally received by FDA, we conduct a pre-filing review within 15 days of receipt. Now, the purpose of this pre-filing review is to determine whether or not the petition contains the necessary data and information in support of safety of the intended use of that substance, as well as meeting the requirements needed and stipulated in the Code of Fire regulations. So for a color additive, that would be 21 CFR 71.1. For a food additive petition, that would be 21 CFR 171.1. If deficiencies are identified in this 15-day timeframe, the petitioner can respond if they are minor. But if major deficiencies are identified, then the petition is deemed not suitable for filing and a not filed letter is issued to the petitioner. If no deficiencies are identified, then the petition is suitable for filing. A filing letter is issued to the petitioner, and subsequently, as you can see on this 30-day mark, a filing notice is published in the Federal Register. Now, the issuance of that filing letter, not the filing notice, but the letter, starts the review clock. So ideally at the 90-day mark, the review team, which again is comprised of a multidisciplinary team of scientists, which we'll get into in the coming slides, will meet to discuss the review of the petition, and they'll have identified any data gaps during the review, any information needed to continue the review of the petition. Typically, then, these are compiled into what's called a deficiency letter, which is transmitted to the petitioner. The petitioner has 30 days to inform FDA of how they intend to respond to that deficiency letter. If they don't respond within that 30-day timeframe, the petition is moved into abeyance, and a petition in abeyance is one that is no longer under active review by FDA. If the petitioner responds with what's called a substantive amendment, that is new data and information in support of safety of the intended use of that substance, then that will reset the review clock and a new 90-day period begins. Now, ideally, at the 180-day mark, the goal is to have all of the primary reviews completed. Now, after completion of the primary reviews, each of the respective reviewers will draft their review memoranda. And the regulatory review scientist, someone like myself, will draft either the final rule or denial notice, which receives clearance from offices outside of FDA. Ultimately, that would be published in the Federal Register. I mentioned on the previous slide that multidisciplinary team of scientists, and here I've generally listed the roles and responsibilities of each. So you can see we leverage a multitude of different expertise throughout our office for different elements of the petition, from chemists to toxicologists, environmental scientists, and microbiologists as needed. The entire review process, again, is managed by a regulatory review scientist who will be the person that engages with our external stakeholder, the petitioner. I'm going to now turn our attention to something that I think a lot of folks have interest in, and that is GRAS, or generally recognized as safe. Now, as mentioned, I've listed here on the slide the food additive definition, which broadly speaking is any substance added to food. In 1958, Congress made it clear that FDA should not devote resources for evaluating the safety of substances for which there is an expert consensus about the safe use of that substance. And this is referred to as the GRAS provision provided for within the food additive definition. And that's listed here on the opposite side of the slide, unless the use of the substance is generally recognized as safe. Now, I want to stress it is the use of the substance, not the substance itself. GRAS is not an inherent property of a substance. So as we discussed, food additives are subject to pre-market review and approval by FDA. They go through the petition process, which I walked you through that general timeline, and successful food additive petitions result in a final rule and subsequently an authorizing regulation in the Code of Federal Regulations, or Title 21 or 21 CFR is presented here on this slide. The GRAS provision, or substances whose use meets the GRAS criteria, are not subject to pre-market approval requirements of the Act. Instead, FDA operates a notification process, which I'll introduce you to in the coming slides. Now, if you find yourself, as any person would, reviewing the CFR in your free time, you might see that there are some uses of GRAS substances that are listed in parts 182, 184, and 186. And on the next slide, I'll give you insight as to why. As mentioned, we operate what's called the GRAS notification program, whereby a manufacturer or a notifier submits a GRAS notice of their conclusion of safe use for a substance to us, and FDA responds in what's called a response letter, and I'll talk about that in the coming slides as well. But before we get into that, let's go through a brief history of GRAS and how we got to where we are today. So by the 1960s, FDA had amended its regulations to include a list of food substances that were GRAS under their conditions of use. And this was informally referred to as the GRAS list. And this was based on common use in food prior to 1958, again, prior to that 1958 amendment to the Act. But throughout the 60s, manufacturers approached FDA requesting FDA's opinion on whether the use of their substance was GRAS or whether their GRAS conclusions were justified, and received opinion letters. Now, these informal opinion letters were not widely available and instead were only available to the manufacturer. However, in 1969, President Nixon had directed FDA to re-examine the safety of substances, which led to what was called the Comprehensive Review and the development of the Select Committee on GRAS Substances, or SCOGS Committee. And this was to conduct a comprehensive review on substances that had either been part of that agency-initiated GRAS list or were subsequent GRAS affirmation petitions that were submitted and received by the agency. So ingredients that were part of that comprehensive review, or those that were part of the affirmation petition process, then resulted subsequently in a formal regulation and a listing in the Code of Federal Regulations. So historically, that's why you see listings for substances whose use is concluded to be GRAS, either in 21 CFR 182, again, as part of that agency-initiated GRAS list, or as part of the GRAS affirmation petition process through 21 CFR 184 and 186. However, after operating under this affirmation petition process for a long time, as one could expect, petitions carry a high workload and a high time frame, as we kind of walked through with the food additive petition process. And this was a very resource-intensive rulemaking procedure. So in 1997, FDA proposed to replace the grass affirmation petition process, with what's called the grass notification program. And that was operating under this pilot program since the late 90s until 2016, whereby the grass final rule was then published. Publication of the grass final rule closed all outstanding grass affirmation petitions. FDA no longer accepts grass affirmation petitions, and instead now we operate under this notification procedure. So let's break out what we mean when we say a substance is grass for its intended use. We've talked a lot already about evidence of safety for food additives. And it's important to note that that evidence of safety is the same for both a food additive approval and authorizing regulation or a GRAS conclusion for the safe use of a substance. In fact, the law requires the same quantity and quality of evidence of safety for both a food additive approval and a GRAS conclusion. But GRAS has an additional component in that that safety data and information must be generally recognized. By definition, it cannot be confidential. That safety data and information, when I say general recognition, must be both generally available and generally accepted. Availability refers to publication in peer-reviewed scientific journals, textbooks, and the like. Acceptance refers to that consensus amongst qualified scientific experts regarding safety. This slide presents the same information, just in more of a pictorial format. So you can see we start with food additive, or we start with a GRAS substance. That is a substance whose use is concluded to be GRAS. We have the same elements for evidence of safety, but GRAS has that added component in that safety data and information must be generally available and must be generally accepted. The GRAS final rule, published in 2016, also brought about some changes to the structure of what became a GRAS notice. I've listed the 7 parts here, and I'm not going to dig into them today. I've listed the URL where you can go to find more information. And as Audrey noted, these will be shared afterwards, so you may peruse all of the URLs that are included in this presentation. But I did want to give you some insight into the types of data and information that go into a GRAS notice. You can see here that it's not just identity, but the manufacturer, the specifications, physical or technical effect, of course, the dietary exposure and how much of the substance is going to be consumed, including the foods in which it is intended to be added, as well as a robust safety narrative that leverages that publicly available and accessible safety data and information. I'd like to walk you through our general timeline for the evaluation of GRAS notices. You'll see some parallels with the petition process, but there are some differences as well. As with the petition process, we also operate an optional pre-submission meeting program where folks, at, again, any time as they're preparing a GRAS dossier to submit to us, may request a pre-submission meeting. We strongly encourage folks to request GRAS pre-submission meetings because we find that it really can help them better understand the requirements of GRAS, as well as ensure that they're making robust and coherent GRAS conclusions. Some of these meetings focus, again, on all 7 parts of the GRAS notice. Again, typically they're about an hour. And a manufacturer, I'm going to refer to them as a notifier, will provide an overview of each of the 7 parts, and they're welcome to ask any questions about any particular thing. Again, we don't evaluate drafts. Sometimes a manufacturer or notifier may have a particular question about one element of the GRAS dossier. For example, maybe dietary exposure, or maybe they have an interest in conducting a study and want to know our insight as to whether or not such a study would be worthwhile to support safety of that substance. So before engaging on very expensive studies, we really encourage folks to come talk to us first to see whether such data points are needed, or maybe whether there's other data that can be used in support of a GRAS conclusion. However, once a substance is concluded to be GRAS for its intended use and a manufacturer has compiled all this data and information, and they choose to come to our GRAS notification program with their dossier in support of that conclusion, we will also, like with the petition process, conduct a filing evaluation. Now, this is typically carried out within 30 days of receipt, but I will note this program is very popular. So it does depend on workload. Sometimes it might go beyond that 30 days. So we do appreciate notifiers' patience once we have received a submission. But once a submission is received, that pre-filing evaluation is carried out. And this is, again, to determine whether or not this GRAS submission is suitable for filing. Does it have all the 7 parts of a GRAS notice? Does it not leverage any confidential data and information? Because, again, the information in support of a GRAS conclusion must be publicly available, and other elements of the pre-filing review. Once that review has been achieved, if the notice is determined that it's suitable for filing, it'll be assigned to a regulatory review scientist. Again, someone like me who will manage and coordinate the evaluation of that notice. Now, this will be the person that will be engaging with that external stakeholder, that notifier, as the process moves forward. Once the notice is assigned to a regulatory review scientist, that regulatory review scientist will issue a filing letter to the notifier, and that will begin the review clock. Approximately 45 days from filing, the review team will have met to discuss the notice, whether or not there are any data gaps, whether there's information in the notice or elsewhere that questions the conclusion of safe use of that substance. And this information will be captured as questions to the notifier, which will then be transmitted to the notifier by the regulatory review scientist. Notifiers have 10 business days to respond to these questions. When they respond with what's called an amendment to the notice, and that is that data and information, again, in response to FDA's questions and in support of their GRAS conclusion. Once the evaluation team has reached a period of no questions, and we'll talk about what that means in the coming slides, then a response letter is issued. Now, there are different types of response letters, and I'm not going to get into them on this slide. We'll talk about them in a couple slides, but I do want to note and highlight here that FDA is mandated to respond by letter within 180 days from filing. However, we may issue a one-time 90-day extension beyond that 180 day, getting us to 270. You'll see a lot of parallels on this slide to the petition slide. Again, we leverage the expertise from a multidisciplinary team of scientists for the different elements that go into the evaluation of a GRAS notice. Again, chemists, toxicologists, microbiologists, and even expertise from staff outside of our office or even outside of our agency, considering substances intended for use in infant formula or products intended for infants, or substances that are regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Food Safety and Inspection Service, abbreviated here as USDA FSIS. We work with them for any GRAS conclusion that we receive for a substance that's intended to be added to products in which they regulate. Much like the petition process, this evaluation is managed and coordinated by a regulatory review scientist. I mentioned a couple slides ago that we're mandated to respond by letter. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, there are 3 types of letters that may be issued at the end of a GRAS notice evaluation. The first, I've mentioned already, a no questions letter. This means that FDA does not question for the basis of the notifier's GRAS conclusion. We have no further questions, and a no questions letter is issued. I really want to stress that this is an opinion letter. It's not an approval or an authorizing regulation, as with the petition process. The second type of letter is what's called an insufficient basis letter. In this case, FDA concludes that the notifier has not provided a sufficient basis for their GRAS conclusion. These notices that result in this are less frequent than a no questions letter. A cease to evaluate is a third type of response, and this may not necessarily be issued at the end of an evaluation. In fact, it may be issued at any time during the evaluation because this is predicated on the notifier. In this case, the notifier requests that FDA cease its evaluation of the notice. And there may be many different reasons why a notifier might do this. Perhaps the amount of questions require more than that 10 business days to respond to. Perhaps additional safety studies are needed that would not be able to be achieved within that 180-day time frame. oftentimes we find that notices that do result in a cease to evaluate are resubmitted to us with that additional data and information. Again, to reiterate, these are opinion letters, however, the no questions letter. It is not an authorizing approval or regulation such as the petition process. I also want to note that for both regulations and no questions letters for a GRAS conclusion, these are not licenses. They're not limited to one manufacturer. So this means that if a manufacturer meets the requirements stipulated in an authorizing food additive regulation or meets the identity, the intended use level, manufacturing specifications, and the like of a GRAS notice, then they may be covered without needing to come to FDA. For the majority of notices that we've evaluated, I'll say that we've responded primarily with no questions letters. And we see this as a good thing because it demonstrates that manufacturers, notifiers are able to understand GRAS and its requirements and make competent, coherent GRAS conclusions substantiated by adequate scientific evidence of safety. That said, there's a flip side to that coin. There are several common misconceptions about GRAS, and these are not all of them, but these are the chief ones that we have noticed, either in engaging with stakeholders, in print media, or in other resources available online. Chiefly, and you've heard me say this throughout the presentation, GRAS is based on the intended use of an ingredient. An ingredient on its own cannot be GRAS. GRASness is not an inherent property of a substance, so there is no GRAS substance. It's all based on use. That is, the foods in which this is being added to, including the use level. The process of notifying FDA of a GRAS conclusion is not mandatory. As mentioned, there is no mandatory pre-market approval requirement. The GRAS notification program is a voluntary program. However, in the absence of an authorizing regulation, or explicitly sanctioned in writing, again, from either USDA or FDA prior to 1958, a GRAS conclusion for the safe use of a substance is mandatory to lawfully add it to food in the US. So the notification program is voluntary, but the conclusion, again, in the absence of an authorizing regulation or some other regulatory approval, is mandatory. Our responses, as mentioned on the previous slide, to a GRAS notice are not an authorizing regulation or approval. They are opinion letters. Color additives, as we've discussed, do not have a GRAS provision. They cannot be GRAS, and color additives must come through our pre-market approval pathway through the color additive petition program. Dietary supplements and dietary ingredients in dietary supplements have their own regulatory pathways outside of GRAS, and dietary ingredients and dietary supplements, in fact, are excluded from the food additive definition and are therefore excluded from being GRAS. So there is no such thing as a GRAS use of a dietary ingredient in a dietary supplement. If you have further questions about GRAS, I encourage you to consult with us. Again, we operate those pre-submission meetings that I've mentioned. We really encourage folks to come in, come early, and come often with questions. And I've listed our general inquiry inbox that you may jot down should you have questions. And that's premarkt@fda.hhs.gov. I want to highlight that there is no last E in pre-market. They never make it easy for you. I also want to discuss something that we've recently published. This is our GRAS panel guidance. It was published in December of last year. And for those who may be unfamiliar with what a GRAS panel is, a GRAS panel is a panel of qualified experts who independently evaluate whether the available scientific data and information, et cetera, in support of a GRAS conclusion is safe under the conditions of its intended use. In most cases, we find that a well-supported GRAS conclusion will not require analysis by a panel. Now, while it's true, if you take a look at our GRAS notice inventory, many notifiers have submitted a GRAS panel statement or a GRAS panel report, we find that in most cases, these are not needed in support of the GRAS conclusion, that there's other safety data and information that may be able to provide evidence of general acceptance. So before engaging in establishing a GRAS panel, we encourage folks to read this guidance. We also encourage them to consider whether it would be useful to support the GRAS conclusion before using resources to convene a panel. It's important to note that a GRAS panel is one mechanism to provide evidence of general acceptance, but it in and of itself does not confer general acceptance. It's just one mechanism of evidence of support of acceptance. So that means that if there's published results in the primary scientific literature that raise no questions about the safe use of a substance, then maybe a GRAS panel isn't necessary in that case. Now, I've reached the kind of end of our presentation here. I have a couple more slides to really drive home the undercurrent or reoccurring theme of this particular presentation as it relates not only to food and color additives, but also substances whose use is concluded to be GRAS. And that is our approach to safety assessment for substances added to food. I like to call this kind of the heartbeat of the presentation, because it is the same for both the petition process and the GRAS notification program. Now, when evaluating the safety of substances added to food, throughout this presentation, I hope you picked up that we consider a multitude of many different facets of information, not just the identity of the substance, but the intended use and the dietary exposure, how much will be consumed, any relevant properties, that is the technical effect, other safety data and information, are there any immediate or long-term health effects? And all of this stems around our safety standard. Per the legislative history of the Act, in 1958, Congress stated that the concept of safety used in the legislation, that is the 1958 Food Additive Amendment to the Act, involves the question of whether a substance is hazardous to the health of man or animal. Safety requires proof beyond a reasonable certainty that no harm will result from the proposed use of an additive. It does not and cannot require proof beyond any possible doubt that no harm will result under any conceivable circumstance. What does this mean? Well, this simply means that due to the inherent limitations of science, FDA can never be absolutely certain from the absence of any risk for the use of any substance. Therefore, we must use the best evidence available at the time of evaluation to determine whether or not there is a reasonable certainty to no harm to consumers when an additive is used as proposed. Now, in the case of a petition, it's the burden of the petitioner to demonstrate this reasonable certainty of no harm. However, because a petition results in an authorizing regulation, the safety decision is ultimately FDA's. For the GRAS notification program, and not just the program itself, but a GRAS conclusion, the safety standard is the same, reasonable certainty of no harm, and it's the same as the food additive petition process. The review standard for both centers around fair evaluation of the data. This means what is in the literature or otherwise available. Some folks like to call this the good, the bad, and the ugly. You can't piecemeal or cherry pick particular data points in the literature that support the safe use of the substance while ignoring those that do not. All of the data and information must be addressed. In terms of our safety assessment, I've listed here our basic elements. Again, we look at what the substance is, its identity, the properties, the composition, the manufacturing process, specifications, and the like. We also take a look at the intended uses. That not only includes the purpose or the intended technical effect, that is why this substance is being added to food, but also the food categories and the use levels. With that, this brings us to dietary exposure. How much of this substance will people consume? And whether it's a petition or a notice, the data and information should also include an exposure estimate based on the maximum intended use levels in the food and food consumption data. And then finally, that safety narrative. Will amounts consumed be safe? What data and information in support of safety is provided and discussed at those exposure levels? And is the data informed by exposure, biochemical properties, or functional properties, or other elements as it relates to the intended use of that ingredient? So taking us back to the very first slide where I provided you with some insight to our approach to food innovation, You can see throughout this presentation, hopefully, that we've had a consistent approach over time. So while something may be a novel food production technology, a new source of a protein, or a new production platform for protein or carbohydrate or another ingredient, our approach has been consistent. We've seen many of these new food production technologies be leveraged in a food additive petition, a color additive petition, and a GRAS notice. So the production process is considered only insofar as it affects the properties or safety of the food. It's important to understand, of course, the potential impacts on properties relevant for safety. That's why we look at manufacturing. And the information needed to establish safety may change if the process changes. So with that, I'd like to hit home some high points as we conclude kind of our presentation here today. Innovations in science and technology, of course, continue to evolve over time, but we leverage our longstanding authorities of policy and scientific knowledge to regulate the safe use of substances added to food. This approach offers flexibility. It's adaptable to a wide variety of new production technologies and even ingredients. And again, we really encourage folks to engage with us early and often. Again, I've listed that pre-market email inbox, which you may request a pre-petition consultation meeting or a GRAS pre-submission meeting, or if you have general other inquiries about the use of ingredients added to conventional food. And I'd like to close out now with this screenshot of our GRAS notice inventory. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation that GRAS conclusions do not result in an authorizing regulation. Instead, those that come through our notification pathway, we respond to with opinion letters. Now, I also mentioned that a data and information in support of a GRAS conclusion cannot be confidential. So we publicly post all of the GRAS notices that we've evaluated, including their amendments and our response to those GRAS notices, our response letters. And this information is freely accessible to anyone anywhere in the world through our GRAS notice inventory. And if folks are starting to think about coming through the notification process, they're gathering the data and information in support of a conclusion, but maybe they're struggling with how to structure the notice, we really encourage you to take a look at substances that may be related that are already listed in the inventory, see what data elements that other manufacturers have provided. Of course, everything is case by case, and one should not use these as canonical, but they can provide a good foundation as you begin to develop a GRAS notice, substantiated by adequate scientific evidence of safety. Now, in this case, I've typed in phage, and you can see here all of the bacteriophage GRAS notices that we've evaluated for uses in antimicrobial and a variety of different food categories. So it is a searchable inventory based on use, based on ingredient. And these last two slides are simply just regulations and other pertinent URLs that we've touched on here today as it relates to food additives, color additives, and substances whose use is concluded to be GRAS. Included is this GRAS notice inventory URL. Again, we really encourage folks to take a look at that, as well as we have an inventory of petitions that are under active review or held in abeyance, and a substances added to food inventory. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Stiffy. That was an incredibly informative and thorough webinar. Very much appreciated for sharing all of your knowledge and insights about these processes. As a reminder to folks, we do have probably about 40 minutes right now for Q&A. Everyone's been doing a fantastic job of submitting their questions through the Q&A box. So please continue to do that. We can keep track of them more easily there. So with that, I will go ahead and start the Q&A portion. And Dr. Heiss, I know that you mentioned in one of our earlier meetings that it would be that you were unable to comment on specific ingredients. So just letting everyone know that that is the case. I feel like some of these questions that might fall into that category. So Dr. Heiss, just please let us know if you're unable to cover something today. And with that, the first question here is around that example of beet juice used for the purposes of coloring. Does that require approval and certification? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the beet juice in that example would require pre-market approval. And so, in fact, different fruit and vegetable juices are listed in our 21 CFR under the color additive petitions. I believe in that case, that one does not require certification. Again, a lot of the ones that are derived from more botanical sources or mineral sources may not require certification. Of course, again, it's case by case, but for like the fruit or vegetable juices, those don't. So in that particular food product, it may be labeled, I'm not in the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, so I would defer to those folks. But what I've seen, not speaking on any formal stance, what I've seen on labels is that something like that would be called color added, or it might be called color added parentheses beet juice, as an example. So in that example, yes, that would require approval.
Thank you for that. And the next question here is around where can I formally request a pre-petition consultation?
Yeah, absolutely. I would encourage you to email that pre-market inbox. Again, that's PREMARKT at fda.hhs.gov. And these slides will be shared and that email address is provided in case you missed it. But feel free to email that inbox. I encourage you to kind of spell out a bit of what the substance is and the intended use, and that you're formally requesting what type of pre-sub, whether it's a food additive, a pre-petition consultation, or a color additive one. And the reason that's important is, of course, for color additives, I didn't mention this, but we do engage with our colleagues in the Office of Cosmetics and Colors for the evaluation of color additives. They are the color additive experts in that case. So they participate in any pre-consultation meeting involving a color additive.
Fantastic. And how long might it take for someone to get a response after emailing that address?
We typically aim to respond within a couple business days. Sometimes, some things might fall through the cracks. So if you don't hear from us and it's been about a week, I would encourage you to just ping that box again.
Fantastic. And continuing on this line of questioning, is there a cost to file a pre-petition consultation? Does requesting that consultation become part of the public record? And how long does it normally take to schedule that pre-petition consultation? Is this something that can take place in a few weeks, a few months? How should people think about the timelines there?
Sure. There's no cost for a pre-consultation meeting or a GRAS pre-submission meeting. They're free. And again, we really do strongly encourage folks to come. Scheduling does depend on workload and staff availability. We typically aim to get them scheduled in about a month, but again, sometimes in the summer months, if a lot of folks are taking leave, it might be 6 weeks. It's definitely not something that is within like 2 weeks. Typically, I would say 3 weeks is about the shortest I've seen. Again, it's case by case, but I would expect to plan for about a month out. And the reason that is, as I mentioned, that a lot of folks who request those will submit materials that are effectively, I would say a PowerPoint is typically most often what we see, that kind of provide an overview of their petition or their GRAS conclusion. And if they have any questions, they're welcome to include those there. And we like to have those no less than 2 weeks out, preferably 3 weeks, so that the review team is able to review those materials and provide constructive feedback during the meeting. And I also want to reiterate that we don't evaluate drafts, so we respectfully ask folks not to send us draft petitions or draft notices, but instead use those meetings to talk and ask those types of questions. In terms of releasability, anything that's submitted to us is subject to the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, so it may be releasable. So we do encourage folks not to include confidential business information in those types of presentations. In terms of a petition, those are not publicly posted to any sort of inventory like the GRAS dossiers are. GRAS dossiers should not have confidential information in them. But a petition may be the subject of a FOIA request. So someone may submit a request to obtain that petition. And in that case, someone like myself, a regulatory review scientist, would go through that petition and redact the relevant confidential or trade secret information.
Thank you. And that's a really great point around that confidentiality element. The next question here and I think you may have actually answered this in the seminar, but just to recap, are the timelines presented for a FAP what actually happens in practice, or does it typically take longer to receive a decision from the FDA?
Yeah, so unfortunately, what I did present is a general timeframe. That's what we strive to do. But as with rulemaking, there can be things that are out of our control. For example, the final rule or the denial notice, those go through and receive clearance from offices outside of our own. And unfortunately, we can't control their timelines. So sometimes they may go beyond that. I would say as a general rule of thumb, petitions, I would expect take, years. And GRAS conclusion is typically a faster process. But again, if it's a color additive, it has to go through the color additive petition program.
Got it. Thank you. And the next question here is from Vincent. Hi, Vincent. Are the FDA investigations, reports, letters, conclusions made public? If yes, where would that be found?
So I'm not sure what is meant by investigations, but I will, I guess, respond as to how I best interpret that question. Our responses to a GRAS conclusion are made public. Those are posted on the GRAS notice inventory, and I think we have over 1,000 GRAS notices that we've evaluated. And so the web team strives to keep that updated as expeditiously as possible. Of course, that also depends on workload. So sometimes there might be a backlog, but the GRAS conclusion, the amendments, and our response are publicly available. In terms of a petition, if it's been approved as a food additive for an intended use or a color additive for an intended use, those are published in the Code of Federal Regulations. So they are issued a authorizing regulation number, and they would appear in the CFR.
Thank you. And then moving along to the next question that was submitted. If a food component has multiple functions, such as heme proteins serving as a colorant and also as a source of nutrition, should multiple petitions be filed in parallel for each of those applications, or could the safety of that be confirmed altogether in one process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll preface by first saying in the food ingredient space, colorant is not used. I do know that that word is used by other regulatory bodies elsewhere in the world. We use color additive. Colorant is actually color that's imparted to food packaging. So I would be remiss for my colleagues in OCAC if I didn't clarify that. But the question is a good one. And we do have an example of that. Impossible Foods submitted a GRAS conclusion for the safe use of their soy lake hemoglobin as a flavor in meat analogs intended to be cooked. And they also submitted a color additive petition because, of course, that heme does impart color to food. So in that case, anything that would impart color would not be considered in the GRAS notification program, because again, to reiterate, there is no GRAS provision for color additives. So a petition would be required, but the petition is just for the use as a color additive. It would be for the safe use as a color additive. But if that substance also has another technical effect, like a flavor, then either a food additive petition or a GRAS conclusion would be the next route. I will say, I would encourage, if you find yourself with such a substance, I would encourage you to talk to us first before submitting 2 submissions, just to see whether or not there may be, it might be better to do a GRAS conclusion first for the uses of flavor and then the color additive, or vice versa. So I would just encourage you to come talk to us for that.
Thank you. And that's such a great point. I know you mentioned that earlier in the seminar that you would love for people to talk to the FDA early and often as they're going through these processes. The next question here is around for GRAS substances for a specific use. Can a manufacturer rely on a no questions letter from another manufacturer for the same substance and use? Or does every manufacturer of that product need to gather their own evidence and get their own GRAS notification?
Yeah, so a GRAS conclusion and an authorizing regulation in the case of a petition are not a license. So they're not linked to a particular manufacturer. So if the ingredient that one manufacturer is manufacturing is manufactured the same way as an ingredient from another manufacturer who has submitted a GRAS dossier and received a no questions letter, and they're intended to be used in the same food categories, the same use level, they have the same specifications, then they may be covered without needing to come to FDA. Again, I'd encourage you to reach out to us via email with maybe more specific information about your particular case, because I couldn't comment on a specific ingredient, but generally speaking, yeah, again, they're not a license.
Got it. And so this other question, I'll be curious to see if you're able to answer it or not. This company would like to use a protein that they say is 15% different from a commonly used protein used in various food and food supplements. The new protein that's 15% different is intended to be in those same foods, in those same supplements. Would this be suitable for a GRAS petition or an FAP? How would you recommend they approach this?
Sure. I would encourage you to request a pre-submission meeting to come in and provide more information about your ingredient and its intended use, because I couldn't comment specifically on that. But in terms of whether you're deciding a GRAS conclusion or a petition, a food additive petition, is the right avenue, there are a few different reasons why a manufacturer may choose one over the other. In the case of petitions, perhaps there's not a lot of publicly available scientific evidence of safety. Maybe the petitioner is generating their own safety data and information because the ingredient is so novel. There's just not a lot out there on it in terms of that general acceptance and general availability of that data and information. Another reason may be because we do have elements of manufacturing in a GRAS dossier. Perhaps the manufacturer is very sensitive to that and they don't want to have that information posted publicly. And in that case, manufacturing information may be one of the elements that may be redacted under FOIA. In the case of a GRAS conclusion, maybe there's a lot of scientific evidence of safety out there that can be leveraged in support of that use. So maybe that's one reason why a manufacturer may go that route. Additionally, as mentioned, the timelines, generally speaking, for a petition may be a lot longer. And so that can add time to results. And a GRAS conclusion, again, we aim to evaluate GRAS notices within 180 days. They do sometimes go beyond that to 270, but a petition, on the other hand, I would expect that would, on a typical timeline, take more than a year.
Got it. Thank you for that. And just a reminder to everyone, I know that it is a bit past the hour. We do have an hour and a half reserved for these seminars. So please feel free to stick around if you're able to. We will be going through all of these amazing questions that you've submitted to Dr. Heiss to get their input on. So just a quick plug that we will be here for another 30 or so minutes answering all these questions. And moving along in terms of the question asking, is it necessary, and again, this might be a little too specific for the purposes of today, but is it necessary to have a GRAS certification before using a lactic acid bacteria, and probably butchering this pronunciation, Weissel confusa, in bread making?
So I will provide some clarification. There's no such thing as a GRAS certification. There's a conclusion of safe use of a substance. And in the absence of an authorizing food additive regulation or some other regulatory approval prior to 1958 from either FDA or USDA, a GRAS conclusion is mandatory for the safe use of that substance. The GRAS notification program, the process by which a manufacturer might notify FDA of their GRAS conclusion, is a voluntary program. But again, in the absence of an authorizing regulation, a GRAS conclusion is mandatory. Now, I can't comment on that specific ingredient for that specific use. I would encourage you to email our pre-market inbox, because we do handle a lot of inquiries such as that, where folks are asking about a particular ingredient, a particular intended use, and we provide them with relevant data and information regarding, whether there is an authorizing regulation for such a use or something else, a history of use, something else, or whether or not, a food additive petition or a GRAS conclusion would be required. So can't comment, unfortunately, on that specific ingredient, but I'd encourage you to email that inbox because we get those sorts of inquiries quite often.
Thank you. And by the way, you're receiving lots of love in the chat for an informative presentation. So just wanted to share that with you. And this is a really interesting question. So they're saying that you mentioned the GRAS notification program is very popular and high use. What do you see as the main challenges of the GRAS notification program? And if you had the power to improve it, is there anything you would change about it?
That's a tough question. Yeah, I don't know, just speaking personally, not on behalf of the agency, I think, one element that I see as a potential, not necessarily a roadblock, but a difficulty is just the misconceptions surrounding GRAS. The fact that, a lot of folks think that a substance is GRAS rather than the use of a substance. And we find that sometimes folks may also not understand that there are certain substances or uses of substances that are exempted from that food additive definition and subsequently from GRAS. So for example, dietary ingredients and dietary supplements, those are exempt from or excluded from the definition of a food additive and are excluded from being GRAS. So there is no GRAS use of a dietary ingredient in a dietary supplement. But that doesn't mean that sometimes manufacturers may not understand that and submit a dossier to us for that conclusion of safe use. And in that case, those notices would not get filed because that is outside the purview of GRAS. So that's why I think it's really important for a manufacturer to come to those pre-submission meetings to really engage with us. And also why myself and other folks from the office engage with stakeholders like the Good at Food Institute and all the folks attending today to provide some sort of, high level overview or education about what these different regulatory pathways mean, because we do recognize it can be very complex. And while the information is on our website, sometimes it's easier to attend one of these webinars to be able to digest it or interpret it a little bit more easily.
Absolutely. And we're so grateful that you're here today sharing all of this wonderful knowledge with our audience. Switching gears a little bit, there's a few questions I'm going to try to consolidate, and it's essentially around the assumption that GRAS is for human food consumption. Is there another program for feed or animal feed if you're producing some sort of novel protein, novel product for use to feed to animals? Are there any regulations around that or any programs that those companies should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would encourage folks with questions about food or feed intended for animals to engage with our Center for Veterinary Medicine. I can't comment on their regulatory pathways, but they do also operate their own GRAS notification program. So I'd encourage you to reach out to them with more questions and information about that.
Thank you. And could you explain a bit more about the self-GRAS process, any pros and cons you see about going that route? I know that that's becoming a more common pathway for quite a few companies in the space. So would love if you could share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, in the eyes of the law, self-GRAS and a GRAS notification are the same. It's all GRAS. It's all under this one umbrella of GRAS. And some manufacturers may choose to make a self-affirmed or self-GRAS or independent GRAS conclusion. And the GRAS final rule does provide for this. We have issued guidance on our website that I would really encourage you to take a look at if you are interested in making an independent GRAS conclusion that is not submitted to us, because in that guidance, we provide some recommendations for how a manufacturer may best compile that information or post that information. So for example, because we post the GRAS notices that we've received and evaluated to our inventory, We encourage other manufacturers who make independent GRAS conclusions that are not submitted to us to maybe post a summary of their conclusion or their complete dossier to their website, because again, the data and information in support of a conclusion cannot be confidential. So the requirements that I outlined today are the same, whether or not the notice is submitted to us. That safety data and information in support of safety is the same. Another piece that's highlighted in that guidance is the recommendation for a manufacturer to present that information in the similar manner as a GRAS notice that we've evaluated. So that would be like the 7 parts of a GRAS notice. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at that. In terms of advantages, one advantage that we encounter in engaging with international regulatory agencies and some stakeholders is that they've shared that they would like to see that FDA has evaluated a manufacturer's GRAS conclusion. Now, even though GRAS response letter is an opinion letter and it's not an authorizing regulation, some folks have shared that some other international bodies would like to see that, breaking out into international markets, for example. Sometimes, we find that manufacturers have shared that a benefit of coming through the program and having that letter is important for marketing their substance and ensuring consumer confidence. And of course, as regulators, we really encourage folks to come through the program because this not only gives FDA insight into what's being added to the food supply, but again, is just a really great vehicle to kind of share all of these GRAS conclusions in one space.
Got it. Thank you. And I think you already answered this, but just to ask in a bit more of a blunt way, if a company has a self-affirmed GRAS ingredient, do they have an obligation to notify the FDA before the ingredient is actually used in food?
So as mentioned, the GRAS final rule does provide for an independent GRAS conclusion that's not submitted to us. So it's not a requirement to come through the program. Of course, we encourage folks to, but it's definitely not a requirement. GRAS is a conclusion of GRAS status for an intended use is based on widespread knowledge of safety, not because of any sort of administrative activity or other listing. So no, they are not required to, but we really do encourage folks to.
Thank you. And this is switching gears a little bit. This person is wondering if the application of the safety assessment and or other food safety risk assessment mechanisms, have they had to be adapted to assess cultivated meat? Could you speak a bit about that process?
So I am involved in the cultivated meat or the human foods made from cultured animal cells pre-market working group in our office. I will say for the purposes of today's talk, that's a little outside the scope. We do have a pre-market consultation program that we do run. And similarly to our GRAS notice inventory, we have evaluated and responded to 2 cell culture consultations from 2 different firms. So I would encourage folks to, if they're interested in that, to take a look at that inventory. The dossier, the publicly disclosable dossiers are published, as well as our memo. And the memo goes into the assessment or evaluation of safety, as well as the response. And if you have other questions, we do have a separate email address that was just set up, but also feel free to just email that pre-market inbox, and we can get specific questions routed to the right folks within our office, or the appropriate folks within our office.
Great. And just a note on that, GFI did host a seminar in January about cultivated meat and what's been happening in terms of the approval process, other questions. It was a fantastic seminar and it's available on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to go and check that out, as it might have some of the answers that you're looking for in terms of a general overview of what's happening in cultivated meat.
Yeah, and I will just add to that, for in terms of FDA's oversight, it's not an approval, just like with the GRAS conclusion, it's a conclusion of safety. So it's, again, our response letter is an opinion letter, not an approval or authorizing regulation.
Really, really great point. And if so, I think you already answered this as well. Someone saying that they provided an email or they sent an email to the address that you had listed. a month ago. They haven't received a response. I know you mentioned earlier that they should probably just email again as things can slip through the cracks. Is there anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's really what I would recommend. Again, sometimes things get slipped through the cracks. We have folks that monitor that inbox and routed inquiries to the appropriate folks, the appropriate subject matter experts who are able to respond. So I would encourage you to just follow up on that.
Thank you. And if there is already a GRAS code for the ingredient they're producing, can someone just operate under that code, or do they need their own?
So I'm going to interpret code must mean a GRAS conclusion. And under that, again, to reiterate, if a manufacturer has the same intended use or use level, manufacturing specifications, identity for their ingredient produced in the same way, they may be covered on that under that GRAS notice without needing to come to FDA. Again, these are not licenses based on manufacturer.
Thank you. And I think this is an interesting question. Do regulatory approvals from other markets, other countries, do those tend to influence what's happening here in the United States? Do those influence GRAS conclusions? For example, if something was approved in the EU, does that have any bearing on if it might be approved here in the United States?
That's a good question. So the short answer is no, that, other regulatory authorities internationally are responsible for their own markets. FDA is responsible for overseeing the safety of the US food supply. Now, that is to say, or is not to say that, if there is an approval in another regulatory region, EU or UK or New Zealand or something like that, that information about that could be an element of the safety narrative. A lot of times, if you take a look at GRAS dossiers, for example, they will include a section that discusses use in other markets, and that could be something that is used in support of a GRAS conclusion, but it would not replace a GRAS conclusion. It's just one element of safety. And the reason for that is a lot of times in other regulatory markets, they may rely on confidential or not publicly accessible safety data and information. And so that's why that wouldn't be a replacement for it, but it could be one element in support of that could be discussed in the context of the notifier's conclusion of safe use.
Thank you. And to group in another question about other countries, which section or department of FDA is available for collaboration in food safety advocacy related to LMICs? I don't actually know what that acronym stands for in West Africa. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a little outside the scope of my office. FDA does have a food inquiry information center that kind of routes inquiries to the appropriate subject matter offices or program offices. So I can provide that URL to Audrey, and maybe they would be able to help you with that inquiry.
Fantastic. And we can share that link in the follow-up email that you'll all be receiving, so you can check that out. Moving along here, can protein or an ingredient greater than 10% be an additive? Or is it considered a nutritional component or GRAS is not applicable?
I would encourage you to that person to come talk to us with that specific case.
Absolutely. I find this question interesting. They're asking if you could speak further about the process for an ingredient that's chemically identical to an ingredient already addressed in a no questions letter, but it's produced in an entirely different manner. What should they be aware of?
So we do tend to see this. In fact, if you look at our inventory, you might find similar enzymes that are produced differently, or even steviol glycosides that are produced differently. Another example is beta-lactoglobulin. We've seen 2 manufacturers come through the GRAS notification program, 2 different genetically engineered microbes to produce that milk protein. And so manufacturing is a very important part of a GRAS conclusion or a food additive petition, of course. And focusing just on GRAS here, the manufacturing piece is important to determine the identity of the ingredient. So even though the ingredient might be the same, if the manufacturing is different, there might be other safety data and information related to that manufacturing meaning that manufacturing may impact safety in another way. And so in that case, my thinking would be that individual, if they're interested, should request a GRAS pre-submission meeting and walk us through that particular case. But just generally speaking, a GRAS conclusion may be needed because, again, that manufacturing is not the same as the one that is already the subject of a GRAS conclusion. And manufacturing is something that is part of the GRAS conclusion, not just the identity.
Fantastic. Thanks for that comprehensive answer. This next one here, can the FDA approve, number one, the design of clinical trials, and number two, approve the battery of tox tests during a pre-submission meeting? Is that something within the scope of the FDA?
Clinical trials are something that would fall outside the purview of my office. That sounds like that's getting more into the drugs or biologics territory. So I'd encourage you to talk to those folks. We do not evaluate benefits in the context of our pre-market pathways. It's all about the safety of the intended use. In terms of the appropriateness of a tox study, I would encourage, again, that person with that particular question or persons to have that pre-sub meeting with us and present, maybe if they're thinking about doing a study or something like that. We do see cases like that where folks are thinking about engaging in studies and we provided feedback. I wouldn't call that an approval. Again, it's a voluntary program, again, in the context of GRAS. So I would encourage that person to reach out to us. We also have data and information on our site. The FDA Red Book has a lot of information about the design of toxicological studies. So I'd point you to that. Not being a toxicologist, I couldn't provide any more information. So I would leverage the expertise of my colleagues. So that's why that pre-sub would be very helpful.
Absolutely. And so it looks like we have two more questions that are linked, both from Amanda. Can you share a list of the acceptable bioinformatics tools used for protein IDs to allergens or bacterial toxins? And then following along with that, can you share the recent notice on allergenicity that was released by the FDA? Do you have any thoughts on these questions?
In the case of allergenicity, I would encourage that person to come talk to us. I can't say that there's a list of different types of analyses that are done. If you take a look at different GRAS dossiers in the inventory, many different notifiers, allergenicity, of course, is something that's very important that we look at. Many notifiers address this in different ways. So there may be more than one way to address this, depending on the ingredient and its intended use. So that's why those pre-subs would be helpful to get that insight from our toxicologist, who would be in a better position to provide feedback in that regard. So I think that's probably the best answer. I know a lot of these answers have been, it depends, or come talk to us, but those pre-subs really are very valuable to get that more focused feedback on the intended use of an ingredient and, planned studies and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And going back to just the previous question, what toxicology site did you mention? Could you just reiterate that for folks that missed it?
Yeah, and I can provide Audrey with a link to that as well. It's the Red Book, REDBOOK. It's a toxicological book on FDA's site that goes through different studies and designs and that sort of thing. But again, with specific questions about that, I would really encourage folks to come talk to us first before engaging in any sort of costly or time-consuming study.
Absolutely. Great takeaway. Talk to the FDA early and often. With that, I think that we've answered all of the fantastic questions that have been submitted. Thank you again, Dr. Heiss. Folks have been sending in thanks through the chat, saying that the content and clarity of the webinar has been absolutely fantastic. So we really appreciate you taking the time to explain all about these processes with the FDA. Really happy to have this line of communication with you. Just a reminder to everyone, we will be sending a copy of the recording to all of you if there's parts that you want to revisit. We'll also be sharing a copy of Dr. Heiss's slides. So again, it has all the information about those emails that you need, those websites. We want this to be an ongoing resource for all of you. So with that, I hope you all have fantastic Thursdays. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next month for the June Business of All Protein seminar. Thank you, Dr. Heiss.
Thank you.